leads to the conclusion that there is a disconnect, a serious disconnect, a deep disconnect because traditional news media no longer seem as relevant, certainly not as dominant when it comes to framing news content. In a simplified way, how news brands and young people view the role and value of news is profoundly different from what we have been used to. Traditional news brands see, this is another point that has come up for discussion whenever this subject is discussed. Traditional news brands, like a newspaper, say the Hindu or the Times of India, at least in the old days, what you should know, news, what you should know is what is given. Young audiences, on the other hand, the finding is, see news as what you should know to an extent, but also what is useful to know, what is interesting to know, and what is fun to know. This, I think, this finding surely applies to India also. What is useful, to some extent, what you should know about COVID-19, about vaccines, about whatever subject. They can be serious, they have their needs, but it's also about what is useful to them as individuals, not what is useful to the general public necessarily, but what they can connect with in their own lives and experiences. What is interesting to know? It should be of interest. And what is fun to know? These are research findings, not just abstract talk, and I think based on surveys. And the role of news for young people appears primarily individualistic. It's about what it can do for them as individuals rather than for society as a whole, as I just mentioned. And so now when it comes to prescriptions, what they suggest is, from this research, the key conclusions, the experience of news should feel as easy and accessible as Facebook and Netflix. Of course, Facebook comes with a lot of disinformation. Facebook comes with a lot of hate. Facebook has toxic effects, which are well recognized and it's been criticized, with also positive things. But what we are talking about is easy and accessible, so easy, second nature to the young. This is partly about how the content is presented, but also about how it is surfaced. News brands need to tell stories in ways that fit the expectations of young people and the moments when they are open to news. It means also creating formats that are native to mobile and social platforms, as well as incorporating these ideas into their own websites. The way the news media cover stories may need to change, including addressing issues such as negativity. Research has found that too much negative news that makes them disengage. They switch off. Stereotypes and how news brands present them both themselves and their contents in third-party platforms. All these come into play. But two themes dominate the picture. These are the major findings. It's not just entertainment or escape that they are seeking. They are seeking, the two key themes are, the research brings out, one is progress. They want progress. They aspire to progress. Goals, values, and ambitions that can be seen as in terms of personal development and to some extent personal improvement through the eyes of the individual. So the basic ideas behind it are, as summed up in this research, I want to develop myself personally. I have goals. I want to reach these goals in my personal life and my work life. And thirdly, I want to escape the limits of societal expectations or stereotypes, to some extent unconventional. And I want to look after myself too. That sums up their vision of progress. The second theme is enjoyment. And you could easily call it fun, but the expectation is that in a world of abundance and ease of access to things, the audience wants to enjoy what they do. This is again a research finding, largely applicable to developed and richer countries, but also to well-off sections in a society like India's. And the basic idea that sit behind it include, I want to enjoy my life, I want to have fun experiences, I want to be entertained, I want to do what I love. That's why a lot of young women come to the Asian College Journalism. I want to be a journalist, I would love to be a journalist, so I want to do what I love. Otherwise you can't explain the trouble they take, outstanding students in other areas who come to journalism. And on the generational question, there's quite a lot of research on this. The onslaught of articles, reports, and publications that proclaim noticeable differences in attitude, value, and behaviors between what they call Gen Z or Z in the United States and millennials. So I think, this distinction has become quite popular today. And for the purpose of research, the key differences are between millennials and Gen Z or Z. Millennials are those born between, in that definition, 1981 and 1996, and they reach young adulthood in the early 21st century. They know the internet to some extent, but they are not into social media. It's not the same. They are digital migrants. And I go before that. My generation is much before that. The age before the computers were known, before the age of lead type and so on. No idea about what was in future. But we are talking about millennials who were born in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, but stopping with 1995 or 1996, who became young adults in the early 21st century. And Gen Z, that's in fashion today, generation born in the late 1990s or the early 21st century, and they know only the digital world. They are digital natives, and we are very familiar with this. Usually the millennials ask the young people at home to fix things. They also code and so on. So I think this distinction, I think, is very important in media strategies on how to engage the audience or this section of the audience that has been getting away. It was never there in the first instance for the established news media. So what does all this mean for the role of news? The core of news, of allowing you to know what is going on in the world, which I mentioned earlier, meets a fundamental human need to connect people's individual world with the wider world. And in that sense, it provides a basis to the social side of humanity. It plays an important role in communication and cooperation in a world where increasingly large populations live and work together. But beyond this, engagement with the news is driven by a broader range of needs, more complex range of needs and roles that can fulfill in our lives. And the research that I mentioned, particularly the research sponsored by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford, and there are many others in this field, it has identified 6 core needs behind young people's engagement with the news. And I just run through them very quickly. Progress, under the theme of progress, status. Going for the news makes a difference to their status. I'm privy to this news, I can use it, and it stabilizes or maintains my status as somebody who's well informed or educated and in touch with what is going on in the world. Secondly, it relates to identity. My identity is partly defined by how I absorb or consume news and connect with the wider world. And thirdly, it's to do with learning. I learn about this. I learn about new things, what's going on. And under the theme of enjoyment, or the head of enjoyment, you have connections, you have entertainment, and you have passions also. It's not just entertainment, it's passions. I'm passionate about this, so I want to, if you want to golf or you're into crosswords or into whatever puzzles and so on, I'm passionate about it, and that comes under the head or theme of enjoyment. So it's easy to go through these findings, think about them, debate it. Very, very hard for the news media to meet the challenge despite having these findings before you. And coming to India, more than 50% of India's population is below the age of 25, and more than 65% of the population is below the age of 35. So this is going to be an enormous challenge for the news media, but also an opportunity if you get it right. There is no guarantee of success. We have to be very clear about it so far as the news organizations are concerned, because no business model has been found, no successful or viable business model has been found yet to substitute for the old business model that has collapsed or has been in decline continuously, made worse by the pandemic. But there is an opportunity out there for news publishers who are interested in engaging, particularly in the Indian case, these younger cohorts. And their shifting attitudes towards news and erratic news consumption makes it particularly challenging to define what kind of journalism might appeal to them. On the one hand, you can't give the audience just it wants. Useless. If you just tail the audience, if you just want to be popular with the audience, that's one way of doing it. Then you're no longer talking about serious news provision or serious journalism. But on the other hand, if you produce excellent content, journalistic content, and the audience is so small, or you put them off by the serious tone, the grave tone you adopt, or by highlighting negative news all the time, or about being just boring for them in terms of writing and formats, then I think there's no use, because this quality is then being wasted. So how do you strike that balance?